In early October this year, 150 Chinese fighter jets flew into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, bringing in war clouds over the Taiwan Strait. It was a warning, intimidation, bullying, call it what you may, to push Taiwan into bending to China's demand to give up their sovereignty and reunite with the mainland. China considers Taiwan a rogue state and has stepped up military and diplomatic pressure over the last 2 years to assert its claim over the island of 23 million Chinese speakers. The United States has been Taiwan's biggest foreign backer and arms supplier, even training its military to counter a Chinese attack as and when it comes. Taiwan says they will fight to the last citizen standing, if that is what it takes, to protect their independence. But despite the rhetoric, the war hasn't come. Is it because of microchips? Have semiconductors become Taiwan's silicon shield? Let's start with what Taiwan has to do with microchips. In one word, everything. Microchips are at the heart of every electronic device you use. Your laptop, your phone, your car, your gym equipment, your washing machine, your gaming consoles as well. Essentially, any gadget that has a display screen or needs to process data will need microchips. Microchips are also the brain of most military hardware like fighter jets and hypersonic missiles. Never before has such a tiny item had such a gigantic influence over global business and innovation as semiconductor chips do in our digital age. So to cut a long story short, microchips are integral to the smooth running of our world. And where do these microchips come from? Taiwan. 60% of the world's microchips are manufactured in Taiwan. It gets better. 92% of the world's most advanced microchips are made in Taiwan. To say that the world is dangerously dependent on Taiwan for microchips is an understatement. The semiconductor powerhouse at the heart of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry is the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which was founded some 34 years ago in an industrial park which is an hour's drive away from Taipei. It is the world's largest maker of computer chips. Apple and Qualcomm are its biggest customers. Not just them, the world's largest and most valuable tech companies are directly or indirectly dependent on them. So is the US military, by the way. For example, the F-35 fighters use chips produced by TSMC. While the exact scale at which the US military is dependent on Taiwanese chips is not known, it is significant enough that the US government has been pressurizing TSMC to shift its production of military-use chips to US soil. Interestingly, a report in Washington Post claims that TSMC's products end up in both American and Chinese weapon systems, and that China's recently revealed hypersonic missile used TSMC microchips. Now, both claims were denied by the company. Many people in Taiwan, though, believe with some seriousness that if China were to invade them, the safest place for them to flee would be the TSMC complex. After all, for China, microchips will be an added incentive for an invasion. And the last place they would want to bomb is a place that controls most of its supplies. For Emperor Xi, it would be a merry situation to have hegemonic control over an empire that drives the world economy. But China will gain very little if it does take over Taiwan's semiconductor empire by force. You see, TSMC depends on the US and Europe for critical inputs like tooling, equipment and software for its cutting-edge fabrication plants. So fab equipment goes from the West to Taiwan, where TSMC puts all parts into fabs that can turn raw material into advanced chips, which then get sent back to the West. So even if the Red Brigade were to take over TSMC and by some miracle keep it running, they essentially would end up dousing TSMC's superpower, which is cutting-edge, state-of-the-art microchips. It's not like the good old days that when you wanted oil, you could simply invade a country and fill your bucket. Integrated circuit fabrication is the most complex and fragile manufacturing process ever that requires subatomic levels of precision and 100% purity of raw material. Essentially, this is not plug and play. Complexity is a barrier and you need human expertise. How much that human expertise will be willing to help given that you have just annexed their country is anybody's guess. After all, these are not the cotton fields of Xinjiang that can simply be ploughed with forced labor. Essentially, hostile takeover, bad idea. Now, if making a microchip is complex, then the supply chain needed to manufacture it is even more complex. It needs hundreds of chemicals and dozens of gases that come from all over the world. Then there are wafers and photomasks that again are sourced from different parts of the world. Accenture in a 2020 report gave us the macro picture. They said a semiconductor product could cross international borders approximately 70 or more times before finally making it to the end user. A White House report had noted that one semiconductor unit had 16,000 suppliers and half were outside the US. Long story short, Taiwan's foundries are not standalone assets but part of a globalized ecosystem. You cannot place it under a new management after a military takeover and expect a happy ending. Plus, let's not forget that China too depends on Taiwan for its semiconductors. Masters at stealing technology from the rest of the world, China for the last 20 years has tried very hard to achieve a degree of self-sufficiency in semiconductor technology, even poaching experts from Taiwan. But alas, they have been met with limited success. Even the most advanced chip foundry in China, the SMIC, is technologically at least 5 years behind Taiwan. As SMIC tests a 7-nanometer chip, its Taiwanese rival has already moved onto a 3-nanometer process. In fact, China notoriously spends $300 billion each year importing semiconductors. That is more money it spends on buying oil. 17% of TSMC's exports are to China. After Apple, the Chinese giant Huawei is their biggest customer. TSMC is Asia's most valuable manufacturing company and likes to stay out of politics. After all, it has large business interests both in the US and China. But in a rare comment, Mark Liu, the CEO, did speak about a Chinese invasion when tensions were high. He said, and I quote, "As for an invasion by China, let me tell you, everybody wants to have a peaceful Taiwan Strait because it is to every country's benefit and no one wants to disrupt the semiconductor supply chain in Taiwan." So are superconductors Taiwan's super Suraksha Kavach? There is a merit to that argument. There is also merit in the world not being so dangerously dependent on one country for something as important as semiconductors. There is a shortage of microchips this year, largely driven by two factors. A, the supply chain was disrupted because of the pandemic. And B, as more and more people work from home, the demand for electronic goods has gone up, which means the demand for microchips has gone up as well. The auto industry was the worst hit. Volkswagen, Ford, Renault, Nissan, Jaguar all felt the heat. They had to slow down or halt production for a while. The prices of cars went up. China and the US are making big investments in their domestic industry to manufacture microchips at home. What is India, the world's second largest smartphone maker in the world, doing? Well, India imports 100% of the microchips it needs. In an attempt to change that, the government has announced a 76,000 crore rupee package to attract investment into the sector. India, as part of the Quad Alliance, will also join America, Australia and Japan to, quote, launch a joint initiative to map capacity, identify vulnerabilities and bolster supply chain security for semiconductors and their vital components. So in conclusion, will China go to war with Taiwan? They may not. But if they do, it will not be for microchips. Importantly for India and the rest of the world, the lesson is to diversify the production of microchips and reduce its dependence on Taiwan.